This is Emergency Jazz with James. Congratulations, you've made it to episode 8. Welcome. Mainstream jazz audiences were shrinking in the 1960s. The previous decade saw popular culture forever transformed by soul and rock and roll, and younger listeners were further drawn away from jazz as funk and rock developed in the early 60s. The still avid fan base of post-bop and free jazz started to dwindle into something of a cult following. What on earth were jazz musicians to do? Well, as has surely become evident in this series, jazz only exists because of collaboration and experimentation. The only natural step for jazz musicians in the 60s was to fuse their music with whatever was around them, in this case, funk and rock. This fusion jazz would embrace techniques from all corners of popular music, employing the emphasis on groove from funk, the clearly defined song structures of rock, and the soaring melodies of soul. And what a combination this would become. Here was a wave of jazz that could recapture the attention of mainstream audiences. And as we'll see, jazz lost none of its potency in the process. Now, it would be problematic for me to suggest a single origin for these ideas. As early as 1966, saxophonist Charles Lloyd was combining psychedelic rock and jazz ideas, and rockers like Jimi Hendrix were jamming with jazz musicians. However, the question of when this music matured and started to spread like wildfire is an easier one to answer. And once again, this takes us right back to our usual stylistic vanguard, Miles Davis. From previous episodes, you'll remember Miles Davis's desperation to escape the complexity of bebop with the spacious sounds of his brand new cool jazz. Well, in the early 60s, jazz had been building in harmonic and structural complexity once again with John Coltrane and Ornette Coleman at the wheel. And Miles was again becoming frustrated. So just like he did in the bebop era, he began searching for a return to simplicity. Only this time he turned to electronic instruments and the compositional techniques associated with rock music. Fusing these sounds was a slow process for Miles, and it involved constant experimentation of mixed success with his quintet of the time, which featured Wayne Shorter on saxophone, Chick Corea on Fender Rhodes piano, Dave Holland on bass, and Jack DeJohnette on drums. This experimentation involved some key innovations, like using more and more electronic instruments, especially Chick Corea's Fender Rhodes, and some of the early synthesizers. They used post-production techniques for their new records, like tape loops, tape delays, reverb chambers, and echo effects. They increased the numbers of their ensembles for certain tracks, adding sometimes 2 extra keyboard players and a host of guest percussionists. And on the musical side, they began to move away from the traditional soloist accompaniment relationship and towards concepts of ensemble improvisation. And finally, they slowed the harmonic pace of their music, sometimes constructing entire pieces on just 1 or 2 chords. In early 1969, Miles Davis put these techniques to the test, touring Europe with this highly experimental quintet. These concerts have garnered an almost mythical status, as this particular music was never recorded in the studio, and all we have is the TV broadcast to document them. They've become known as the Lost Quintet. After this mysterious tour, Miles and the crew returned to the States later in 1969, overflowing with ideas. And it's here that they created 2 watershed albums, In a Silent Way, which was a pretty subtle and introspective fusion, and the less subtle Bitches Brew. These albums employed the vast soundscapes of no less than 3 keyboard players, played by Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, and Joe Zawinul. You may have heard of them. The virtuosic guitar of John McLaughlin, as well as Wayne Shorter with his array of saxophones, and a host of guest percussionists. Let's listen to some of these wild electronic sounds in the opening track of the double LP Bitches Brew, Pharaoh's Dance. This track, Pharaoh's Dance, is actually 20 minutes long in full, and it's well worth a listen. I'd recommend it. This album, Bitches Brew, was something audiences had never heard before. It set crucial trajectories for the jazz fusion of the 1970s, not only in its reliance on electronic effects, but also the increased emphasis on groove over harmonic pace in the structuring of the music. With Bitches Brew, jazz fusion spread quickly through jazz communities. This was a music that welcomed collaboration with a wider range of musicians, and also, crucially, it appealed to a wider audience. As I said earlier, you may have recognised those other keyboardists from that Bitches Brew album because they all go on to lead their own respective jazz fusion empires in the next couple of years. Now, I cannot begin to cover the extent of this music spread today. All I shall attempt to do is clarify the innovations that guided jazz fusion as an ever-evolving style, and give you a starting point to go and listen to this magical world of music. Where better to start than with Herbie Hancock? Before finding jazz and eventually becoming the star keys player in Miles's second quintet, he was a classical piano prodigy, even performing as a soloist with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra at the age of just 11. His first solo jazz album, Takin' Off, in 1962, was a hard bop masterpiece of space and style with immortal charts like Watermelon Man and Driftin', all written by Hancock himself. Now, after working with Miles Davis, his fascination with electronic instruments took off, and he formed a new septet by himself to explore these sounds. Herbie Hancock specialised in riding the cutting edge of synthesizer technology throughout his career, but perhaps his more important innovation in these early experimental years was infusing jazz not with rock aesthetics, but with the soaring melodies and driving grooves of funk and soul. This was something others had attempted in the mid-60s, but Hancock managed to balance the soul and jazz influences perfectly, captivating audiences around the US in the process. His late 1969 album, Fat Albert Rotunda, featured a band more concerned with establishing an unstoppable groove than the constant improvisation of piano comping and walking bass improvisation. Listen to this chart, Tell Me a Bedtime Story, from this album, and keep your ears open for the harmony of the opening passage. There's something captivating and unusual here. To the keyboard. There's something strange and beautiful about the opening bars of this piece. It feels off-kilter somehow. Let's dive into what's really happening. We start with this G major 7 sharp 11 chord, with that C sharp at the top, which clearly leads us to believe that we're in D major. That C sharp feels very at home there. But then the melody is this, which has a G sharp in it. And G sharp has no place in D major, let alone a chord of G major 7 sharp 11. What we have here is polytonality, where we can hear this piece simultaneously in D major and in A major. Now, this crept its way into jazz in the 1950s in the music of Dave Brubeck. But this is jazz fusion. This is supposed to be appealing to massive audiences. This was the brilliance of Hancock's composition. He took avant-garde harmonic techniques and presented them in such an approachable way that the huge audiences listening to this music still loved it. Herbie developed these ideas further to reach international acclaim with his Headhunters band, formed in 1973. Their self-titled debut album featured state-of-the-art electronic instruments like the ARP Odyssey synthesizer, Moog synthesizer, and the ARP Soloist. And it also featured the immortal funk extravaganza track, Chameleon, which you will find on the playlist below. Keyboardist Chick Corea also featured on that Bitches Brew album from Miles Davis. Overflowing with ideas from this project, he set out on his own in 1971 to create a completely different fusion style, this time using Latin and rock as his sound sources. After some considerable experimentation, he formed the band Return to Forever, which included Brazilian vocalist and percussionist Flora Purim, drummer Airto Moreira, Joe Farrell on flute and saxophone, himself on the keyboard, usually the Fender Rhodes, and a young Stanley Clarke on the bass. They recorded 2 generation-defining fusion albums, one also named after the band, and another in 1972 called Light as a Feather. The title of this album epitomizes Chick Corea's musical contributions to the fusion world. Rather than finding fusion in modern synthesizers and mixing newer funk sounds and grooves, his album Light as a Feather was a more introspective approach to modernizing Latin jazz. And the combination of flute, the silky smooth Fender Rhodes, and Corea's effortless sounding keyboard technique really do make this album sound light as a feather. Like Hancock's Headhunters, Chick Corea's band reached a much wider audience than older jazz styles, and the effortless synthesis of light rock, jazz and Latin are epitomized in the last track of this album, Spain. Listen to this. Flora Purim, vocalist and percussionist extraordinaire, shone in Chick Corea's early 70s albums and found herself developing yet another strand of unique jazz fusion by herself. Her solo debut album, Butterfly Dreams from 1973, was a fantastical mixture of Brazilian grooves, psychedelic rock and jazz harmonies, and it was born out of a career of diverse collaborations and a unique compositional voice. Butterfly Dreams is vastly underappreciated in how it set trends for musicians across the fledgling fusion world. Purim used unique instrument lineups, pitting folk instruments like the zither against electronic clavinets. She also explored extreme vocal techniques, harmony pedals for the flute, and frequent post-production sampling. Listen to the virtuosic groove and hypnotic soundscape of this chart, Dr. Jive. While we talk about Latin rock jazz fusions in the 1970s, there is one name with whom this is synonymous, and that is, of course, the great Carlos Santana. Now, I could talk all day about Santana's contribution to fusion music. In fact, perhaps no one did more to bring the worlds of Latin, blues, rock and jazz together in the 1970s. So why is he not the centre of this whole episode? Well, apart from his 72 record Caravanserai, his music only uses hints of the jazz worlds that grew out of the 1960s. His innovations were the effortless blending of rock and Latin, and his jazz techniques are few and far between. So, as groundbreaking and awe-inspiring as his music is, I'll leave the Santana story for another day. With this, we return to Miles Davis alumni Joe Zawinul and Wayne Shorter. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, they had been establishing themselves as front-running jazz performers and composers. and in 1970 they struck out from Miles's project, along with Czech double bassist Miroslav Vitouš, and formed a band of their own that you may have heard of called Weather Report. Their principle was simple: develop the Bitches Brew concept of ensemble improvisation, thus abandoning the traditional solo accompaniment demarcation of older jazz, and add to this a boatload of electronic instruments and some meticulously crafted arrangements. Here they had something the world had never before experienced. Their self-titled debut album of 1971 made shockwaves among early fusion audiences with its blend of rock and funk aesthetics and avant-garde soundscapes. This first work was predominantly seen as a logical extension of their work with Miles Davis, but they soon took it a lot further. At Zawinul's instigation, Weather Report moved more towards jazz funk, with grooves drawing more heavily from R&B music and a mixture of pre-composed and improvised song structures. Here, Zawinul came into his own with his pioneering work with ARP and Oberheim to create bespoke synthesizers just for Weather Report. As a result, their 1973 album Sweet Nighter was at the cutting edge of technological innovation as Zawinul exhibited a new way of voicing and patching electronic tones. While innovative and well crafted though, this album displayed deep tensions in the creative interests of the band. The repetitive funk style didn't suit Miroslav Vitouš's bass style, and Shorter and Zawinul went through several drummers, never finding the perfect sound. They got closer with their 1974 album Mysterious Traveller, which featured electric bass playing replacement Alphonso Johnson. This work had tightly controlled song structures, replacing the improvisation-led shapes of the first three albums, but still with such an emphasis on groove, setting clear relationships for each instrument whilst leaving space for free-flowing creativity was crucial to the band's success, and they still hadn't quite found the right balance. And so we are led to 1976 and a moment that many contemporaries would describe as the making of Weather Report, when a 24-year-old musician walked up to Joe Zawinul after a concert and introduced himself saying, "I am the greatest bass player in the world." This was, of course, Jaco Pastorius. Jaco's bass tone was remarkable, with a highly distinct articulation that you can recognise anywhere, and he could play lightning fast R&B and funk bass lines, as well as dreamy solos using false harmonics. Joe Zawinul quickly saw to it that Jaco had all he needed to record his solo debut album, appropriately titled Jaco Pastorius. This came out in 1976 and featured Michael and Randy Brecker, Herbie Hancock, Hubert Laws, and a very young Pat Metheny. Check out this track, Donna Lee, from this breakout album, and you'll recognise it as a Charlie Parker bebop chart. But yes, Jaco Pastorius plays the melody on a fretless bass guitar, which is an extremely virtuosic thing to do in itself. But then he launches into a post-bop funk fusion bass solo that changed the life of every bass player on the planet. Overhaul of instrumental technique was a key part of jazz fusion. Whether it was Chick Corea plucking the strings on the inside of the piano, John McLaughlin's double-necked Gibson guitar, or Herbie Hancock's arsenal of synthesizers. But it is fair to say that no one overhauled an instrument so completely as did Jaco Pastorius. And if all of this wasn't enough, he also had an in-depth understanding of modern studio recording techniques and had a stagecraft that would ignite Weather Report's live presence. Pastorius was established as Weather Report's sole bass player for their 1977 album, Heavy Weather. And with this as a band, they had arrived. no one could ignore the instrumental and compositional virtuosity of this album, and with the right personnel finally gathered together, the collective improvisation element fell into place. This was the album where Joe Zawinul wrote the legendary piece Birdland. And just listen here to how different it sounds to anything we've heard so far, especially Jaco Pastorius' false harmonic rendition of the opening melody in the introduction. Another member of this new generation of jazz fusion stars is the guitarist Pat Metheny, the guy who featured on Jaco's debut album. Well, Jaco Pastorius also featured on Pat Metheny's debut album, which was called Bright Size Life, and it was recorded in 1976. With just Jaco, Metheny and Bob Moses on drums though, this was a jazz fusion guitar trio album. An introspective, stark contrast to the normal maximalisation of fusion ensembles, this album showed a remarkable maturity in jazz fusion style from a group all under the age of 30. It fused post-bop harmonies effortlessly with funk grooves and each player's unique innovations in instrumental technique. If you've never heard this album before, you must go and check it out immediately on the playlist below. Today I can barely start you off with these musicians. Pat Metheny's work would keep evolving on the cutting edge of jazz fusion for over 20 years. He would win 20 Grammys and push fusion jazz performance to a new level of rhythmic virtuosity with crazy compositions like First Circle in 1984, which featured some very strange subdivisions of the 12/8 and 10/8 time signatures. It's here that I reach something of an impasse. From 1974 onwards, the growth in jazz fusion becomes somewhat exponential, and there are simply too many names and stories to cover today. You have fellow Miles Davis alumnus John McLaughlin with his Mahavishnu Orchestra, which was a jazz rock fusion with Indian classical music influences. You've got Bobby Humphrey and her return to the blues with an R&B twist in her album Black and Blues. Her music is fantastic. And of course, there is Donald Fagen, who led the group Steely Dan in the late 1970s. The arrival of Steely Dan signalled a maturity in the musical language of jazz fusion, especially their 1977 album Asia, which was a landmark not only in recording technology, but also in the virtuosity of jazz fusion grooves and compositional style. This was stylistically perhaps as far as jazz fusion stretched, before other musicians took us down a rather regrettable route of smooth jazz. Jazz fusion divided some opinions. Its priorities of ensemble improvisation, funk, rock and soul song structures and aesthetics, and its embrace of new technologies and instrumental techniques was seen by some as abandoning the principles of jazz. I hope I've made clear though, from episode 1 of this series, jazz only exists because of a culture of collaboration and fusion within its ranks. To deny jazz fusion its definition as jazz would betray a deep misunderstanding of not only where jazz came from, but what it's all about as an art form. And this leads me to a question. Is jazz more inherently fusible than other popular musics? Maybe there's something about its underlying harmonic principles and concepts of ensemble communication that make it more adaptable and prone to fusion. On a final note, the musical trends we have discussed in this episode are particularly relevant to the jazz world we find ourselves in today in the 21st century. The difference is that in the 70s, jazz was fusing with funk and rock, but since around 2012, we've seen jazz embracing influences from hip-hop and techno music. To find out more about that though, you need to stick around for the last 2 episodes of this series. It has been an absolute pleasure to bring this to you all this week. Thank you so very much for watching. My challenge to you this week is to take on the Chick Corea track Spain from that Light as a Feather album. I'll leave a link to the backing track in the description below, right next to this week's playlist, chock-a-block with fusion jazz bangers. And as always, please get in touch with me if you have any questions or comments about the music and artists and stories that we've covered today. Until next time, everyone, see you for a little bit more.